or two, but let's go ahead and get started for those of us that are here. We're going to start with the call to order and the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all for coming tonight. We do have a couple board members that will not be here. Shannon and Doug both won't be able to be here. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Brenner. Are you starting this? Turn it over to Dr. Brenner.
I sure can, but I'm always happy to reintroduce Tom Weber and his team from SiteLogic. So Tom, I'll just let you introduce your team as they come up to the microphone today. But I want to thank all of you for, again, making the trip up here to Grand Forks, and thanks for your continued partnership.
Thank you. We love to be here. You guys have a great community, a great school district. So a little cold out there today, so I'll apologize ahead of time if my brain is still kind of thawing. I've lived my entire life in the upper Midwest. You would think I'd be used to this by now, but one day I hope to find myself maybe in Florida or Arizona. So anyway, our team here, and most of tonight will be interacting with you guys and you folks between yourselves. But our team is Darren Overton, who our task force knows and has worked with our community engagement team, and Brian Peters, who is, I don't remember your title these days. Pardon? Program executive, that's what it was. Brian's part of our engineering group, and then Sarah Guyette is with our architectural group. So we certainly can lean on them as need be throughout the evening. And you'll be hearing more from these folks as we continue through the process as well. So, okay. So tonight, and we've got a lot to do tonight, but I think we can hopefully move through it fairly efficiently. We're first off going to just briefly review what we talked about last week in our workshop. I shouldn't say last week, in our last meeting 2 weeks ago. Revisit our priorities from last time, and you should have gotten definitions on those via email, and there's also printed copies for you in front of you. And then we'll have some discussion on the acceptable tax impact. We started that discussion at the very end of our meeting last time, and so we will pick that discussion up. And then lastly, and where we'll probably, I'm assuming, spend most of our time tonight, or quite a bit of it anyway, is discussing the allocation then of what that tax impact looks like between the building fund and the bonding that you guys had picked out. Okay, so with that, I'm going to run through the review fairly quickly, but please just throw up your hand or interrupt me if you want to talk more about something that's up there or want some clarity, perhaps from last time. So first off, we talked a little bit about the process that we're going to use. And our process here started out with our meeting last week, kind of setting the foundation with information on a lot of the things that we're doing. Tonight, we're going to start talking about some of the scope that's involved in what we want to try to do, talking about building fund and capital bonding. We'll get into talking about categories of how some of that money is spent then, after we make some decisions tonight. And then lastly, we'll look at what ultimately that final solution looks like. So as we kind of build our process triangle. And of course, as always, we will put things onto the parking lot that might not be most appropriate to talk about tonight, but will be more appropriate at a further meeting so that we don't forget those things. Just reviewing again, too, that our success overall really depends on keeping in mind three key questions that we have to ask ourselves about what our outcome is. The first question is, does it make sense for kids? And this is intentionally number one. This is the business we're in, right? And so does what we're doing make sense for kids? Number two, does it make sense fiscally? Obviously, we need to be able to afford it. We need to work in the budget. Obviously, there's some nuances around that in particular here, and so we want to pay attention to that. And then lastly, does it make sense politically? And that's really the answering the question, is the community with us on this? And if we go to a referendum, are we able to pass that referendum? And so those are really the three questions that we want to try to keep in mind. If we can answer in the affirmative to all three of those questions, then we're probably in a pretty good place. So we also talked a bunch about what the task force work was, but I think one of the big messages that we heard from the task force, and we do have some task force members here again tonight, so if and when we want to lean on them for some insight, we can. But one of the things that really came out there is that the folks on the task force, the folks in your community, they love the schools in town. They don't love change like most of us, but they also realized after going through that process of 20-some meetings that we really can't stay the same and be successful. And of course, I just wanted to put this up one more time. If we're going to count on magic, something magical happening, as much of a fan of Disney as I am, it's just probably not likely to work. So, all right, we talked about some of the fiscal things Scott did for us, which was awesome, and I'm sure Scott can offer some insight tonight again if we need. This is just a quick summary of where a lot of your expenses have been over the last 6 or 7 years. And I think kind of the big takeaway from this is that our construction services, the amount of money that we're putting into construction services has gone up over the last 6 or 7 years, and the amount of money that we're able to put into other expenses, which are those programming things for your students, is going down over the last 6 or 7 years. As we look to the future from a fiscal standpoint, revenue is projected to be pretty flat. So it's been flat. We've had a little bit of an increase, but projected over the next couple of years here of continuing to be flat, depending on what the state does with their budget in a few months. The interesting piece here is that you've had a total of 4% increase. That's not an annual, that's a total over the period of time from 2014 through, or I shouldn't say, that's from 2017 to 2023. It's projected to be a total of 4% increase. We know inflation itself has outpaced that amount, and so that's part of what makes things difficult for us. Additionally, we're spending considerably more money per student on capital projects from our operating budget than other school districts in the area do. And so when we take a look at this, the last year ended at $484 per student in the investment from operating fund for building-related projects. The next closest one is $154. That's Fargo. And when you look at that difference and say it's about, say, $150, you end up with about $2.8 million more that you're pulling out of your operating budget than those other districts would for building-related projects. And as a result, most of that money has come from the fund balance that you have, and that fund balance has been fairly well depleted at this point, where the projection at the end of this school year would be probably somewhere around 2 or so weeks of operating capital in your fund balance. And so that, as we have heard, is and I know you've heard it in other meetings besides these, that there's a priority, obviously, to try to rebuild that fund balance. So then, after the fiscal side of things, we talked a little bit about facilities and facility conditions, and we started out talking a little bit about the facility effects on student achievement, because again, we're focused on kids and what their student achievement is. And so looking at indoor air quality, lighting, temperature and humidity, acoustics, those types of things, how do those affect student achievement, and then where are we at in Grand Forks relative to those things in our buildings? We also took a look at the physical infrastructure and how old your buildings are. And with this chart here, the orange bars are the average, the original age of the building. The blue bars are the average age, the blue dots are the average age of the building. And so when the blue dots are close to the top of that bar, that means there's not been necessarily a lot done to those buildings over its lifetime. We also took a look then at a school-by-school basis in some regard. We didn't spend a lot of detail on each particular school, but we looked at asset conditions in those schools. And the notable thing here, I think, was that at Valley Middle School, the number of concerns that we have there, including a small section of black in the pie chart, just highlighting it up there. And we don't see that often when we go through physical building assessments. And that's kind of the danger zone. Now, it's not danger zone per se from a safety standpoint, but it's a danger zone from an equipment standpoint, and the potential for impending failure on some of the equipment and infrastructure pieces that are there. Also looked at it relative to the elementary schools, and so again on these charts here, caution is in yellow, alert is in orange, red is the alarm area. And the ones that we're really keen in on are those ones that are nearing or over 50% orange and red. And then we took a look, and the task force spent a fair amount of time looking at this, and we'll take a look at this again later tonight. But kind of a heat map of where your buildings are and what that summary of condition is for each of those buildings in the district. And so the red dots are ones that have larger investments, the yellow ones moderate, and green dots would be smaller investments required. And then from a density standpoint, this is showing your student density, where your students are living. And so the darker the orange, the more student density there is, and the greener that it gets, the less student density that there is. So you kind of get a little bit of an overview on that. The letters in the circles, I should say too, E is for an elementary school, M is for a middle school, and H is for a high school, if that wasn't something you had already assumed. Then we got to talking a little bit about funding options for doing some work in the buildings. And we talked about grants and rebates. We talked about CARES Act dollars that are coming, self-funding energy project, building fund increases, and general obligation bonding. And then if you recall, we did a little bit of surveying on that. And relative to being a component of kind of this long-term facility and budget plan, we determined that that would not necessarily be a good source of consideration towards that long-term planning. Conversely, self-funding energy project, everybody was in a consensus that should be considered part of the planning process. Increasing our building fund should be a part of that process, and the general obligation bonds should be a part of that process. Those last two, the building fund and the general obligation bonds, both require voter approval, and those are the things that we'll be talking about later tonight. Any questions on the review part of that? No? Okay. So revisiting our priorities, and this is something that the group wanted to do, and hopefully Amber will be here sometime soon because she was, oh, there you are. I'm sorry. Welcome. Anyway, I know you had some input into this last week. So, all right, so revisiting the priorities.
I'll make it easier for you.
Yeah. It's never easy for me. All right, so from a priority standpoint, the 10 priorities that you see on the screen are the priorities that came from the task force, and the task force spent some time talking about and evaluating and ultimately ranking in kind of a hierarchical order. There we go. As I had mentioned before, we did provide definitions because we talked a little bit about what these priorities meant, and the idea that we kind of wanted to try to be on the same page as to what we were thinking about these priorities or what these priorities involve. Now, it wasn't really my intent tonight to go into great depth in reading the definitions that you see on the screen. I included them in the PowerPoint so we had a record of them, and if the public wants to go take a look at what we did tonight on the website later, that these things would be there so that everybody could share in the definitions. You have them on your desk, and I think they were probably emailed over to you a little bit earlier today. We can go through each of them individually if you want. We've got a fair amount of things to talk about tonight. But I guess that what I would do is open it up and see, from last week, are there any of these that we want to talk further about, or as you've read through any of the definitions, you want to spend a little bit of time talking about them. And if you want, while you kind of glance through those, because I see a few people are glancing through them right now, I can give you just a quick summation of what these are. And so the student's ability to learn, excel, and be successful really talks about enhancing the academic success and positive personal growth of students, and kind of ultimately answering the question, are we able to prepare students for success in the 21st century? Safety, security, and accessibility are many of the things that you would think that they would be as far as safety is concerned, but not just from an intruder potentially in the building, but we're talking about other things like fire and weather. We do get tornadoes up here from time to time, so are we covered from that standpoint? And then also ADA standpoint. So Americans with Disabilities Act went into place, I believe it was 1991 or 92, and that came a lot later than what most of your buildings were built. Right? So a lot of your buildings were not built with that in mind. And so how does the idea of safety and security impact those with a disability? Budget sustainability talks about whether or not we can accomplish what we're looking to accomplish within a balanced district budget and not compromise student programming in the process. Healthy and comfortable environment is really talking about things like that indoor air quality and ventilation, temperature, humidity, sound and light, the things that we talked about that were on that one slide that we saw here just a few minutes ago. And of course, indoor air quality, as we know well now, does affect our health. But humidity and temperature also directly impact those health things. In our task force presentation, you heard a couple of our task force members talk about having been in school when we've had students that have had heat stroke and those types of things in a non-air conditioned building. And then the other thing is how that impacts, in particular, sound and light, mental health. And there is a direct correlation to some of those things with mental health as well. Physical and the flexibility, and quality of the learning environment. Again, here we're really talking about are we able to accomplish the learning objectives that we want in our schools to the fullest extent? We're looking at things like space per student that's available to us, what the kind of layout and flow of the classroom and the building is. What are the equipment and resources available to both the teachers and the students? And can we really function in the intended way, again, for student achievement? And how does that also impact it in the future? So are we, I hate to say it this way, but are we future-proof? Can we change as times change, as technology changes? Are we able to change in our schools to accomplish those things that we want to accomplish for kids? School facility equity really talks to, do all of our kids have an equal opportunity, an equitable opportunity, to achieve? So equity is not equal, and we spent quite a bit of a task force meeting talking about this subject with the task force members. And we know that not every school is going to look the same. Not every teacher teaches the same, but they should have that equitable opportunity to succeed, have those resources to them, and be under the same conditions, if you will. And so one of the things that we talked about in task force meetings relative to this is if you've got a student at South Middle School, air conditioned, 68 degrees, year round, 70 degrees year round, trying to learn, their algebra. A student at Valley, in a classroom that's 90 plus degrees, are they able to learn in an equitable standpoint? Do they have kind of an equitable opportunity to succeed? And so those are the things that we're talking about there. Cost and tax impact is I think, probably fairly self-explanatory. What is the tax impact, and are we honoring the community in taking a look at that? And then operational cost control is whatever we're doing, how does it affect our operational budget? And we know right now, most of the things that we're doing have a pretty direct effect on our operational budget. But the things that we're doing, do they hurt or do they help potentially our operational budget? So I know I said I wasn't going to go into a great amount of detail, but when I saw people reading, I was guessing that you might have wanted an opportunity to take a look at that. I forgot the last two. Student community pride is, I think, probably pretty self-explanatory as well. Do you have facilities that your students feel proud to go to, that they want to be there, your community is proud of when they're showing them off to people from outside of town? And then welcoming and aesthetically pleasing facilities. Similarly, how do your facilities reflect the education that's going on inside those buildings? And a lot of times what we talk about is the school district and your facilities, therefore included, are a direct reflection of the community that it serves. And so what I would ask is, knowing that we do have good community support, the community loves your schools, but do your facilities truly reflect what that priority is that the community puts on school? All right, so I'm done with definitions, so questions?
Just the one that I brought up last time, and
Yes.
it's minor, just adding teaching to the flexibility and quality. I think we said of teaching and learning, thinking about the fact that teachers also need all of these things, and it's without them teaching.
Absolutely. That goes without question. We did kind of go through this to try to make sure we included teaching, and I apologize that we perhaps missed it there. I did get input from some of our task force members as well, as I said, and so they caught a few things that we made sure that we included as well, but I apologize, Cynthia, that we didn't catch that one. But you're absolutely right. Others? Do we feel pretty good that we at least have a decent understanding of what those priorities are then? Or at least can have a common understanding of what they are? Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I just like to say it's nice to see that there's enough information, but it's not so lengthy that it's burdensome to read. So
I tried to keep it to 2 pages.
The wordsmithing is wonderful. Thank you for that.
I have to thank Lori. Is Lori here someplace? There she is. Former language, English, Latin. She had to help this engineer here a little bit with, some correct punctuation and what have you. But Jeff,
The priority ranking on this sheet, is that from the task force, or was that?
Yes. So yes, on the printed sheet that you have, that is the ranking that you gave them last time. Yep. Amber.
I think this is a great overarching kind of 3,000-foot view, and it doesn't leave it up for us to interpret what these are. This is a very probably minor thing at this point that may become a parking lot issue, but I think I'm looking at future getting some of these in front of people, right? So envisioning a postcard that gets sent out to the general public. If we have 8, things on a postcard, that's a pretty convoluted card. And so now that we have these definitions, I just kind of went through and said, well, could we sort of just do 1, 2, 3, and 4 boxes and then put some of the other ones underneath as sort of subheaders? Do some of the other ones represent more of an overarching, and then some of them fits more specific inside them? So again, I think that might be a parking lot issue. I certainly don't want to couch or hide one of the headers under another if it's not appropriate. But if we could make it work, I certainly, students' ability to learn, excel, and be successful, safety, security, accessibility, budget sustainability, welcoming and aesthetic pleasing facilities could be like the top 4, and then you couch the other ones that fit into those definitions. So again, that likely is a parking lot issue to just set aside in terms of how we're going to communicate these outward. I definitely appreciate the work put into creating definitions for us, so thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And there is the ability, Amber can do that. We've looked at that a little bit. In fact, Dean, who just walked in, had sent me a nice little thing on email when he took a look at these from the task force that kind of broke those into some categorical areas as well. And so we can definitely collaborate a bit on that as we get a little bit further into the process and want to share this in a more intentional way out to the community. Eric.
Amber, I agree with you, although I like a more detailed, longer list for our school board work. I think when we, like you say, when we go out to the public, it's got to be elevator speech and shorter and stuff like that. And I'm sure Tracy and your team will be able to do that. I kind of like the longer list for us when we're doing our work to keep an eye on it. But I agree with you, when we go out to the public, it has to be more concise.
Did we take a look at all, Tom, on how some of these mirror our strategic plan at all?
We started to take a look at that, but I think I would feel more comfortable sitting down with the staff here, or even a representative number of you guys. I don't want to pretend that I can represent your strategic plan in any level of detail, and I sort of felt like I might be making assumptions if I tried to tie these. But I think it's an excellent idea, as I said last time, to look at doing that tie-in, especially from a long-term standpoint. But I think I'd feel more comfortable sitting down perhaps with Dr. Brenner and his folks, and or, like I said, a couple of you guys. And I'm certainly open to doing that.
I have one more question, and I know you just went through these. So the budget sustainability is the big picture budget. The operational cost control, that's more lights, heating costs?
Well, the budget sustainability, is long-term. Are we able to do what we need to do with a balanced budget? Right now, you're not able to do that. You've been deficit spending every year to do that. So that really speaks to that. The operational cost impact is really, how is it impacting our operational budget? Is it negative? Is it positive? And you'll see tonight when we talk a little bit further about some of the things and the options around the funding, that there are opportunities there that impact the operating budget in a very positive way. There's pros and cons to everything you do, but from an operating budget standpoint, they impact operating budget positively. And so that's one of those things then from a priority standpoint we take a look at. And if we're going to check the box, if you will, as to this idea, how well does it address our priorities, that's an area that we can say, yeah, we feel really good about impacting our operating budget. All right, anyone else on the definitions? I wanted to bring this forward again then as well, and this came from our task force as well, and they did a really nice job tying these priorities together. And I think it's worth just reading real quickly so that the public can hear it, but healthy, comfortable learning environments and the flexible learning environment will in turn give the students the ability to learn, excel, and be successful. which in turn then affects the student and community pride, which then gives the public a reason to invest in the cost and tax impact, and gives money to support school facility equity and welcoming and pleasing facilities. And then, in turn, with all this, we have a plan for operational cost control in order to get budget sustainability and fiscal responsibility. And I thought it was particularly insightful about how these are all connected. And so not one priority really stands out there on its own. They're all priorities we talked about, even though we tend to rank them sometimes. They're all very important, and they're all connected. So I didn't do this last time, but I thought it would be worthwhile now that that we had the evaluation from you guys, just to kind of see how it lines up with how the task force did their hierarchy of priorities. And you see some real similarities here when you take a look at it. Sometimes, you know, one or the other is flip-flopped. I think the two that kind of stood out to me, and then I'd certainly open it up for any of you guys to offer whatever opinions you have, if you have them. But let's see now, where was it? I know what one of them is. With school facility equity, you guys ranked higher than the task force did, which I thought was interesting. And the other one was, it's a budget-related one. Operational cost control, that was it. Yeah, thank you. So you guys ranked that lower, and the task force ranked that quite a bit higher. So those are the two that stood out to me. So I don't know if anybody wants to offer any thoughts on that. I'd certainly open it up to you if you care to. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Not about that, but just about in general. I don't want people to get the idea that, well, we can look at this and we're going to do the top three and not do the bottom nine. As your statement said before that, it all weaves together, and there's no, you know, we did rank it, we did prioritize it, but I don't think it's a prioritize that, well, we can do half of them, or we can do a third of them, or we can do, it's kind of an all or none. The only one exception would be, in my mind, would be the last one, which we both ranked last, is, yeah, we want them aesthetically pleasing and stuff, but that's not quite as critical to the education of the students. So,
Right.
So I just worry that people are going to look and say, well, yeah, we'll do 6 of them or something like that.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think there's probably a reason that students' ability to learn, excel, and be successful ends up at the top of the list. And priorities that are similar to that and other processes that we've done generally do as well. And that's really almost a summation of all the other things that are there. So.
I would say something that I glean from these lists is not just the board, but the task force and the communities. What's the word I'm looking for? Just their commitment to a quality education for our kids in this community. I think we certainly recognize that education comes at a cost, and having a sustainable budget and being fiscally responsible so that we can communicate and be transparent with our taxpayers is very important. But we also want to have an institution of learning where students can learn and feel comfortable and have access to a quality education. And I think I appreciate the task force ranking a student's education high as well. And certainly, like Eric said, that doesn't mean that these other things maybe don't matter. And, you know, the board certainly, in terms of operational cost control, being third from the bottom is, you know, we're not saying that we don't care about how our dollars are spent, but ultimately we care about, you know, small class sizes and having the availability of programs offered to our students. And so I just think that that's an interesting dichotomy there with the public, and I hope that we're able to tell that story of a quality educational environment in Grand Forks Public Schools, and why we need the ask from the public for that to be sustainable.
Well, and I think it starts with these meetings and your conversation and your input that folks will see as it's put out on YouTube, as it's reported on in the newspaper and those types of things. So it's a great start. So go ahead.
The only other comment I'd have is when I look at these priorities, the other thing I think of is, what if we decided to do nothing? Or what if a referendum failed? What would happen to these 12 priorities? And I think that's something we have to keep in our mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a real good point for probably many of the conversations we'll be having. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. Alicia, Evan, as you look at the lists, you've been in the district for some time. What do you think of the work that we and the task force have done, and what could we have done better?
Well, first, it's pretty nice to see like a student's part at the top, because like no student really like has in their mind like what it costs to like run the school and stuff. They're worried about like themselves and the education that they're getting. So that's, I guess, what I see, and I really like that. I mean, I know you guys have a lot bigger of a challenge to figure out how it's all going to work money-wise, but I know I like seeing in like the top 5 that it's all pretty much student-oriented.
I agree. I think it's important to put the students first. I think because that's what obviously like the school board is for. Yeah, so it's really nice to see that students' ability to learn is at the top for both. I think it's really important.
Thank you.
I love when we hear student voices in these conversations. Okay, so moving on. I don't know if you want to, I put it in here because I didn't want to go against anybody's thought process. There was some thinking last time that we might want to do the ranking exercise again. We don't have to necessarily, as far as I'm concerned. We know they're all important priorities. I would leave it up to the group. If you want to, we can definitely go through the ranking exercise, but if you're comfortable with what we have, I'd be happy to move on as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, when I look at that, like operational cost control, I look though at, where was it, budget, sustainability, and fiscal responsibility takes care of operational cost control in my mind, because if we have fiscal responsible, then we are doing the operational cost control, you know, so they blend in, and that's why where they're situated, to me, doesn't make that big of a deal on this one.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's no question, and they're all. I mean, we could probably sit here for quite a while tonight and say, well, this one really impacts that one, you know, because if we don't have this, we don't have that, and so yeah, you're absolutely right. They are very much connected with each other. I was working with a district not too long ago, and they had one similar to tax impact, and it ended up on the very bottom of their list. You know, it wasn't because they didn't care about the tax impact. But just all things being relative and how they connected, it ended up on the bottom of the list. And again, it was still important to them. They still paid attention to that as they continued through their process. So anyway, go ahead, Amber.
I agree with you, Bill. I think when I look at the 3 cost ones, I look at it in terms of how they're defined. The budget sustainability and fiscal responsibility is sort of the board's purview and overview, and then the operational cost control really is the district sort of managing those day-to-day costs, and then the cost and tax impact is that relationship between the public. And so I think you're right. They all sort of fit in and are connecting, but I really see those 3 tiers as the relationship between the board, the district, and the general public being defined in those ways.
All right, so do we want to re-rank? I heard one that we don't necessarily need to. I didn't hear anybody come out and say, no, keep moving? All right. We will keep moving. Okay, so now we're going to get into some new stuff to some extent. We did start this conversation last time, but we're going to talk a little bit about what that acceptable tax impact is. And so I'm going to forewarn you that this can be at times a little bit frustrating because everything we're going to be talking about is kind of cyclical, if you will, or following a circle, right? And so there's no perfect place to start. And so we're going to start in one place and see how that impacts as we kind of come around all the issues. And we know that when people go to the voting booth, one of the things, probably one of the most important things that they're considering when they vote for a referendum is, how is this going to impact me from a tax standpoint? Okay, we'd like them to perhaps think differently about that, about the educational quality and about kids, but at the end of the day, it's really about how this impacts me and my pocketbook. All right, so we're going to start with talking about acceptable tax impact. And I bring forward my buddy Bob Barker because what we're talking about here is very similar to the game show Price is Right. And if you recall that game show, if you happen to watch it, when I was a kid, I was a fan of Bob Barker. You get as close to the price, but you can't go over. If you go over, you lose. And the same thing is here, is when we look at a particular tax impact that we're going to put forward as potentially part of a referendum, if we over-ask, if we go too high, that referendum will fail, and we're left without being able to do anything. And so we want to be particularly intentional about this in what amount that the voters will accept. So Scott was great about going through this again and can answer some questions if we need. And I put up these slides in particular too because a couple of you guys missed at least part of this explanation the other night. So from a property tax standpoint here, when we take a look at how Grand Forks is able to fund schools relative to the other districts that you see up there, you get a much smaller slice of the pie, if you will. So property tax is, as you guys know, but not always everyone in the community understands, is made up of a variety of different entities: the city, the county, in your case, the Parks Department as well, the school district, right? All kind of issue a certain amount of property tax. And so when we take a look at this, Grand Forks, you get about 30% of your residents' property tax, whereas in Fargo, for instance, they're getting 53%. So considerably more of that slice of pie goes to schools in these other communities than in Grand Forks. And we can see that spelled out in actual numbers here. So I won't spend a great deal of time on it, but again, it just kind of shows what that property tax dollar amount is that people are paying here. And so this is based on a $250,000 house. That's our average home value. And so all of the conversations that we'll be having about tax impact are based on an average $250,000 house.
Can I ask where you got the average number from?
The average, Scott, maybe you can help me out there because I think I got that from you personally.
Yeah, actually, one day, Tom, we were looking at I have to think of the website, we were looking at city.
Oh, city data, is that where you?
City data, it was, I think like about 3 years old, but it was, at that point, it was like 237,000 or something like that. So the 250,000 is, should be a relatively fair estimate, I believe.
When you look for those things, which you want to be real careful of, sites like Zillow, for instance, they'll give you an average sales price of a home, not necessarily the average value of a home. And so City Data is one of the sites that pulls their information from census information, and so in various counties, and so it tends to be a little bit more accurate.
Are you referring to tax value of a home versus market value of a home?
Amber, in this case, that's the 250,000 would be the market value. The tax calculation, for example, you can see the taxable value of 11,250. What that is it's basically it kind of breaks that down into a mill levy. So the calculation is basically taking the market valuation or the taxable valuation times 50%, and then there's a 9% that goes into the mill, and that's what calculates the tax areas down below. But yeah, in reference to that number, that was that particular website we looked at was close, and in conversations with some others, it's we've kind of that's kind of where we're seeing things at. Fargo, showed actually not much higher from an average valuation standpoint. As Tom said, it's not based on recent home sales; it's based on valuations of homes within the communities, not recent sales.
Any other questions on this? Okay. Oops. Okay, so another thing that we took a look at here was just what the property tax is doing here in Grand Forks over the last 10 years. And so Scott was able to bring this graph forward. The blue bar up on top is the total amount of property tax that, again, somebody with an average valued house in Grand Forks would have and see. The orange line is what the school portion of the property tax is. And so you can see here that back in between 2012 and 2013, you saw a pretty significant decrease in the amount of taxes that are paid. That was because of the state kind of changing their funding formula for schools and picking up some of that extra burden at the state level. And really since about 2013, your taxes here in Grand Forks have stayed very level and not really gone up at all. So we started out at about $1,183 in 2013, and back in 2019 then, the last data point here, $1,136. So actually a little bit of a decrease even yet from 2013. So not a lot of property tax increase to be talking about over the last several years.
Scott, there seems to be, in conversations that I've had with others, and you listen to the radio and general public talk, there seems to be this myth that property tax has gone up, or we're getting more money now than we had before, but this certainly would seem like it tells a different story. So how do you explain that, and how would we communicate that with the general public?
Mm-hmm. Sure. And so the graph that you see, that data was pulled from, every year the city of Grand Forks puts out an annual assessment report. And so that's where I got the data from for this graph. And, taxes, property taxes have gone up from the perspective of, likely home values increase between 2012 and 2013 when that mill levy dropped, when the state took on some more of that obligation. But for example, the home I lived in 2013, I lived there through 2017, and my home valuation went up quite a bit. But even at the end there, if I would take a tax bill from 2013 and compare it to, say, the 2017 tax bill, it was still less. As time goes on, market valuations increase, and in taxes go up, and you would have to look really at, you can see, for example, the orange line there is the school district, the lower line. Again, you can see the mill levy was flat, other than in 2019, there was a 3 mil increase for the special reserve fund. And you look at the blue line above, and in 2017 and in 2019, there was an increase. That was not related to a mill increase by the school district. That would have been a mill increase by either the city, county, or park district. So, and so that's where when you look at that kind of the school district piece of the pie, the school district's independent of the other entities, but when an individual looks at, a homeowner looks at their property tax bill, it's a combination of all of the taxing entities. So that's where really we need to look at them separately from that perspective.
Scott, I'm wondering, most people, when they think, they just think, well, this is what I pay the government each year. And it isn't just property taxes, it's utilities, utility fees, sales tax, and things like that. And have not those gone up over time? And does that maybe factor into the psyche of the people?
Yeah, certainly, that's very possible. You're right. All of the other, sales taxes increased. Our utilities with the garbage and other fees have increased over those years. But when you look at the property tax, the school district mill levy did not change from from that 2013 time frame until 2019. The mills increased by 3 mills at that point. Otherwise, completely flat at the school district level. And 2013 was that 2010 to 2013 was a huge shift in taxation in the state of North Dakota. From, you can see the significant mill levy decrease by the school district and the county. Where the taxes on the same valuation dropped almost $900 in that time frame. And also from about 2009 to present, North Dakota individual income taxes are 40% less than they were then. It's a lot of it, I think, comes down to when there is a decline, and then things change over time. It's people sometimes forget about that significant change in that one year, and as you earn more money, you pay more income tax as well, for example. But still, the rates are 40% less than they were 10 years ago.
I just wondering, Tom, in 2012 to 2013 is when the state of North Dakota took away 7 mills from the Grand Forks public schools. And that was roughly close to a $2 million hit that we did. And their rationale was due to the referendum that was passed to eliminate property tax, and that was their way of doing it. And then they were going to help us out with more money, and that happened for 1 or 2 years, and then it went flat. Do we need to educate the public on that? Because this is, you think about that, if they would have just left it alone, that's roughly $14 million that we would have had in our budget that we could have used.
A great point, Bill. When I think of telling the story from a revenue perspective from the school district standpoint and a taxation from the taxpayer standpoint, the slide we're looking at, the decline in the mill levy, taking that in combination with the slide that we looked at earlier with the per pupil payment and showing what roughly would only be a 4% increase over 7 years if it is going to be flat again these next two. For the school district, there's been a significant decline in property tax revenue without a proportionate increase in revenue from the state.
Yeah, and that's the point I'm making, is that you look at where our intern fund has dropped roughly $14 million. Well, if the state leaves their hands off our $2 million a year, we still have that money in our budget, and I don't think we tell that story enough, that, some of this was letting buildings get behind repair, but yet the other part of it was the state taking money from us and not replacing it as they promised.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Bill. There's many factors that bring us to where we're at today, not just one factor. And I agree, that is, it's a difficult thing sometimes to be able to communicate in an easy way to understand, because nothing about school finance generally makes a lot of sense to the average person, or even those of us that maybe know more about it doesn't. But that is absolutely part of that story that needs to be told as we communicate with the community. Chris?
So as we get into the finite details and then the big picture, in your experience working with school districts, what is the best message, the best form of messaging that goes out to inform the public of the why, serving the people that are detail-oriented and also the people that are big-pictured? What have you seen in your experience from various districts?
Yeah, in my experience, Chris, there's you have to come at it from several different directions. And of course, we'll have an opportunity to talk a lot more about that when we get to that point in time. But whether that's social media, some fast facts type of thing that's bulleted, kind of quick information, but also taking the time to provide some white paper type information on some of these subjects where there is more detail, that folks who are interested can at least see that. It's for the community. What's really, really important is that transparency piece. It might be a tough pill to swallow, but let's get it out there. Let's be transparent. Let's talk about where we're really at.
Then a follow-up. Have student voices been used in other districts? Of course, that would be a parent's choice. I'm certainly not recruiting here this evening, but that would be a choice for a family. But have you seen that as well?
No question. And it depends a little bit from that standpoint on what we're asking for in a referendum, or a school district is asking for. If you're talking about trying to make classroom improvements in an elementary school versus athletic, things at the high school, or maybe HVAC equipment, you're looking at different messages, different stories, and of course, different folks are best at telling those stories.
Thank you.
Okay, so I showed this for perspective before we kind of get into a question. And so we don't need to worry right now about the difference between how much we perhaps provide from a bonding standpoint and how much we provide for a building fund standpoint. We'll cover that. But I wanted to provide some perspective here just on dollar amounts from a monthly impact standpoint, because that's what we're going to talk about next, is what is that right dollar amount. And we'll use it from a monthly impact standpoint, because I think it's easiest for us to just have that smaller dollar amount in our head. It obviously translates into an annual amount. But what is that right amount that the community as a whole can accept as something that they could vote yes for in a referendum, that's not too high, that we strike out like you would in The Price is Right? And so, think about yourself and how that impacts your monthly budget. Think about your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, your coworkers, what they may think. And of course, I had mentioned we'll survey on this as well and bring some of that information back. But for purposes of us continuing our process, we really want to try to establish where you guys think we're at this point. And again, this can be a little bit of a difficult question, but we've got to start someplace, and this is the best place to start, I think. So, hopefully you'll remember the polling from last time. It looks like most of you brought computers. Amber, you get your phone. This one might be a little bit tricky on the phone, but I'm sure you will. All right, so if you can go to web browser, and I think you'll have to at least use your web browser on your phone. If you can go to pollev.com/promptbread951, and I'll come around in just a second and make sure you guys are able to connect. You should see, you should get connected at least, and then I'll have to double check on my computer real quick if I've activated the question yet or not. And what this question is what they call an upvote question. And so what we're going to ask each of you to do is put in the dollar amount that you think is the right amount. And I'll come around and just kind of help you out a little bit here, but you'll see everybody's dollar amount come up on your computer screen, all right? And then what you do is, just like in social media and the likes that we have, you can either thumbs up or thumbs down on what you believe that entry was. Okay, and we'll take a look at how many thumbs up and thumbs downs we get on those dollar amounts. And if you see something trending or you want to kind of adjust your answer, you'll be able to enter in a second amount. So if we see you start at, let's just hypothetically say you put $10 in there, 10. And you're seeing that folks are kind of trending towards numbers that are a little bit higher than that, and you feel a little bit higher than that, feel a little bit more comfortable than that. You can go in and you can enter in then maybe 15, you know? So you can enter in up to 3 numbers total in the process. Okay, so I can see some of you guys are getting used to this. And you just want to be able to go down that list and just mark a thumbs up or a thumbs down to each of the answers that are there. And like I said, I'll come around and just kind of make sure you can see that. But I don't need to check that it's active because it's clearly active.
Monthly, right?
Monthly, yes, monthly.
Can you show that don't we need that previous slide to kind of show what that would mean for the person? No.
And I don't think so, not necessarily. No, I mean, you know, it's those were the dollar amounts that are associated with certain bonding levels and that type of thing. And we will look at that closer tonight yet, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of perspective on that. And so, so we're seeing a little bit of up and down voting. So I'm going to come around and just make sure you're feeling okay about that. So you should have an opportunity to answer each person's entered. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we've got everybody's entered, and so you should have an opportunity to thumbs up or thumbs down each person's item. So everybody got all their thumbs up and thumbs down answered? I don't see a lot of activity going on. Okay, so if everybody has entered, thumbs up and thumbs down on all of them. So what we've got here, it looks like, is we've got two $50 a months in there, a 30 and a 45. And then on the negative side, we've got 20, 20, and 25. So what this tells me is you guys are tending towards a little bit higher dollar amount, being in favor of. And so really ranging from 30 to 50, with 50 being two of the answers up there. So 50, just because they're typed in differently, they're ending up on two different lines. So had they been entered in the same nomenclature, that would have been at the top. So what I would ask is how do folks feel about 50? Because not everybody thumbs up that. Go ahead, Bill.
I think it's too high.
Okay.
So
I thumbs up it, but I think in general it's probably too high. I'd be interested to see once we poll the public.
Right. Okay.
I think it's too high.
Okay. So let me ask this. So, all right, so clearly this side of the room over here thinks 50 is too high. So I'm assuming you guys over here are a little bit more okay with it just because we've got some positive results on the screen. Does anybody care to just offer where you think that might be okay? Go ahead.
I thought of families, that $250,000 home, who lives in those homes? Big picture, what can they afford? What are they able to do above and beyond paying taxes and meeting all the necessities of their home? Trying to put myself in the shoes of a family that would be being asked $600 for a year. Where would that be and how would that fit?
Right, right. And just for those who are following along perhaps at home as well, if you happen to live in a $125,000 house, then that impact would actually be about $25, not 50. However, if you live in, a $500,000 house, then that's probably $100 a month. So just, it's fairly ratio driven. Anybody else want to care to offer some thoughts on that discussion? So we've got some folks here that think it's too high. You guys think it's reasonably good. What I think I will do is, since we've had a little bit of conversation, if anybody wants to have some additional conversation, perhaps what we can do is I'll clear those and let's go through the process one more time and see where we're at. I would tell you personally, I know you didn't ask me, but I'm going to share with you anyway. My experience with this is that 50 is probably a little bit on the high end from a successful referendum standpoint and what we see in communities. I think that's probably a little bit aggressive as far as what can pass. Now, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what will pass and what won't pass. But I would suggest that that's probably a little bit on the high end for what we'd see. Terry.
And Tom, just for clarification, this would be combined for the mills and for the bond, correct?
This would be total, right. So regardless of what we put into the building fund, regardless of what we do from a bonding standpoint, this would be the total impact on that referendum. So it might be two different questions. If it's $50, it might be one question that's $30 impact and one question that's $20 impact. But this would be the total impact to folks.
So when I was thinking about 50, I was thinking about the buzz that you might hear on talk radio. And so that's why I think 50 is too high. Because I think that there could be a perception that we're just like going after whatever we can get. That's kind of why I shirked away from it. I also work with a lot of families I don't know, the average cost of houses has really gone up. So even if I think that a house isn't worth $250,000, they've really escalated in price. So I try to think of what's going to be out there when we hear the talk of this. That's what I was kind of leaning to.
I guess one point, just how I looked at it, is you can sell it monthly, but at the end of the day, people are gonna think, okay, what is this gonna look like on my tax bill? And $50 a month is a $600 increase on my tax bill. And right now, I'm paying the school district $1,100. That's a huge jump of how that looks.
Yeah, and I
You know,
think that's a
and I
really
think
good point, Bill.
That's where people look at that total number. You know, I've been involved in a few bonding issues, and they don't tell me what it cost me a month. I don't pay by the month. I pay at the end of the year.
Yeah.
What is that going to cost me?
All right, so it's open there, 3-6. We got one person who has not put in an amount in yet. And again, if you want to tweak your number, if you thought, you see 37 and 35 up there at the top. If you think 36 maybe is the ideal, you can go back up to the top and you can enter 36 if you want. And then just watch your screen too, so as any new numbers come in, you can thumbs up or thumbs down those new numbers that are brought in. I see everybody kind of resting. Am I accurate on that? Okay, so now what we've got, after a little bit of conversation, we've got 33. I like the inclusion of this cents there. So 33 is up there on the top, and essentially tied with that is 35. And so what I might suggest we do is proceed down the road of using even, and being just slightly conservative, of using somewhere around between 30 and 33, maybe 32, to do our work going forward. And obviously we'll check this against survey with the community, right? But that would be my suggestion. Now, this is your process ultimately, and you are the ones that need to make the decision, but I'm going to make that suggestion for us that we use that in a conservative manner to continue our planning going forward. Are folks pretty good with that? I'm seeing some thumbs up. I'm not seeing anybody say no. Okay, so that's awesome. You guys did well there. That wasn't too difficult.
For the record, I held back playing the Bob Barker game and putting $1.
I would have thought that was great, actually, by the way. I bid $1. $1, Bob. All right. Yeah, you might have. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about then how we allocate those tax impact, all right? And we know that we've got two different funding models there. We've got building fund to talk about, and we've got bonding to talk about. And so this is a total, so that'll be split, obviously, between those two areas. So I want to start out with just giving you a little bit of background information, and this will be good background information for our continued work as well at the next couple of meetings. So we have worked with Chris, our folks, in particular Brian Peters, on developing and looking at a complete list of projects that have different dollar amounts associated with them, that have a variety of different priorities with them. That list has over 700, I believe, projects on it. It has been compiled from multiple sources, so SiteLogic's engineers and folks that have been around the district over the last several months have provided some input. Chris Arnold and his staff have provided a considerable amount of input there. previous assessments that were done in the district have entered into this equation as well. And then when I say it's vetted by Chris Arnold and Brian Peters, Chris and Brian literally sat down and went through project by project by project to understand what those were, make sure that projects that may have been out there from an assessment before that had been already done were taken off of the list. Anything new that needed to be added was added. All right, so they were all gone through. They were categorized by what we call a FIM, which is a facility improvement measure. So we typically divide these things out into about 12 different categories. And then they were prioritized from an engineering standpoint as to what is most immediate needed versus other things that were less priority. Now, it's very difficult to take a look at a great big huge database or spreadsheet of all that information, and so we won't be spending a bunch of time tonight, but as we go forward and look at these things a little bit closer, there is an interface that can be used that compiles all that information, is able to give us that information in a little bit more reasonable manner for those of us laymen to take a look at and understand the information and kind of discern what it's talking about. And so this is just a couple of screenshots of what those are. And we'll have an opportunity to look closer at that stuff at our next couple of meetings. So when you take a look at all of those projects that are there and kind of summarize them, from a priority standpoint, they're ranked essentially from 1 to 5. 5 being the highest need and 0 or 1 being the lowest need from a priority standpoint. And so we're able to sum those all up, take a look at them by school. We can also take a look at them by category and those types of things. But what I wanted to just point out to you here is from an immediate need standpoint, this is what we have on that sheet. Now, again, we'll get into some additional details on this in our work coming up, the next couple of meetings. But what I wanted to call attention to was the dollar amount at the bottom of that column that are essentially immediate need priorities. It's about $50 million if you can't see that real closely on the screen. So you may be asking, well, what is in that column from a project standpoint, from an immediate need standpoint? And so when we take a look at the list, there are projects that deal with failing infrastructure, failing electrical systems, HVAC system needs that we've got. Chris has obviously been taking care of a lot of those, but not all of them have been resolved yet. Various ADA issues, secure entryways are in there, and then a variety of other safety concerns. Now, they're not all of the safety concerns necessarily. It's not all of the ADA issues, but they're the highest priority items that are either code compliant or from an HVAC system, something that may keep Chris up at night, that a boiler may fail and we may not have heat in a building, those types of things. What it does not include is building additions. So if you think about maybe trying to get away from portables, right, and adding actual square footage on, does not include things like that. Does not include programmatic updates. It does not include interior spaces and finishes updates. I'm not saying there aren't those projects on the list. They are, but they're not in that immediate need category. It does not include things like air conditioning and dehumidification at schools where that is not present. Okay, so I just wanted to point out what that does not include then. So when we take a look then at that in relation to what the recommendation from the task force was, this came from the task force's presentation. So we looked at item number 1 last week. Number 2 here talks about those projects that they believed were rose to the top and were formally part of their recommendation. So A was replacing Valley and West Middle School, as renovation is no longer viable at those schools, in their opinion, for a variety of reasons. Consolidation of several smaller schools in the district is required to provide equitable facilities, programs, and opportunities for students. C is addressing special education and medically fragile areas in some of our schools and make sure that those are equitable. A healthy learning environment, so we've had conversations about that. And that goes to all of those aspects of air quality, lighting, temperature, humidity, and sound that we've talked about. And I think the most conversation was generally around the air quality items. And then safety and security and accessibility items that we talked about primarily with the priorities. It covers those items like secure entryways and other safety and security items. All right, so that's what was included in their recommendation, to recall that from their presentation. The third component to their recommendation then talked about how to go about doing that. And so they had recommended a amount of about $90 million to address immediate needs, and then a progressive increase of the building fund of 2 mils per year for 5 years. There's an asterisk there. They had a great deal of debate on whether that's the right way to do it, or go for 5 mils of additional building levy full out right off the bat. And I will tell you that there's a bit of discussion about whether that should be potentially 10 mils of building levy. And really, most of the task force came down on one of these two areas at the end of the day after we did some polling with them as well. So what do we do with those dollars, in particular from a bonding standpoint? They had suggested that 70 million roughly dollars would go to consolidating West, Winship, Wilder, and then also rebuilding Valley Middle School as kind of a consolidated common K-8 campus, okay? So that could be the same building. Think about a duplex, if you will. It's got a common wall, perhaps, or it could potentially maybe be 2 buildings. But nonetheless, use the land that's available in that area. They also then thought that because there's about $20 million left after that, that additional high priority projects at Ben Franklin, Kelly, and Schrader would be most applicable. And when we look at it, those are schools that had higher needs at them. All right, so that was their recommendation to you guys. So we'll have an opportunity to talk about this and what your thoughts are, but I wanted to bring that back in front of you so you understood what that was. When you take a look at what the impact of we'll say 5 mils because it's the easiest one to calculate, the 5 mils and the $90 million bond, that comes up, I have to check the exact number, but about $25 a month. Okay, when we talk about that impact amount. So just a little bit less than where you guys were at. And that was the dollar amount that they felt, pretty reasonably comfortable with was the mid-20s. Okay, so you guys aren't too far off from that, but just a little bit higher than where they were at. All right, so how does this work then between the building fund, and is there any questions, by the way, on the recommendation? Sorry.
Not on the recommendations, but on the priority list that Chris, Arnold, and Brian had vetted.
Mm-hmm.
This may be a stupid question, I just want to make sure. Does it include West?
It does, yes. There are projects there at West, right, Brian? Yep.
Okay, that's what I need. I just wanted to know that. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Anyone else? Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, my question is the new kitchen. I struggle with that being in phase 1. And the reason I struggle with it is we've been constantly talking about education.
Yep.
And all of a sudden we go to vote or people get information on it and they said, oh, they're building a new kitchen.
New kitchen, yeah.
What else is in that priority that we don't know about? And that's what I struggle with, having that in the project. I have no problems with, Ben Franklin, Kelly, Schrader, all the schools based on, and I know our kitchen is in a bad location,
Yep.
and it needs some work, but I I'm just wondering if that might be a great project that we go to the city and say, how about the industrial park, provide us land out there and give us infrastructure to do this project, because you always want to help us. Maybe we can get a TIF for that.
So
or something,
let me provide
But anyhow,
So let me just provide a little bit of insight on that, and you guys can kind of hit me in the back here if I'm misrepresenting that. So the reason, one of the primary reasons the kitchen's on there is that the kitchen is located at Valley Middle School, all right? And Valley Middle School is, if you recall, on the list of projects, a project that they did not believe was any longer viable to be renovated. So if we take down Valley and rebuild it, right, that would almost certainly have to include the kitchen, because the kitchen is a part of Valley Middle School. And so that's where that is at. Relative to where that kitchen is located, I think the task force in total was leaving that up, really to others to determine what the best location was. That said, they did not believe that the kitchen was in a good spot at Valley, and so whether it was located on this site at the district office or the industrial park or something else, they did believe that it needed to be in a more convenient space from a commercial standpoint, because of the truck traffic that's involved and those types of things, and so not a residential neighborhood. So does that help provide just a little bit of insight, Bill, at least as to why that's there?
But when we're selling this project, we have to make sure people aren't surprised that there's a kitchen in this.
Absolutely.
Because I can imagine rebuilding that kitchen is 12 million?
Not that much,
Is it not
no.
that much with that large freezer building and all
Yeah,
that?
it's
not?
probably more like half of that, just in
Okay.
real rough numbers. The estimators back at our company are probably shivering right now because Tom's starting to throw out numbers. But anyway, yeah, but it's not unless you're going to do something extraordinary with it, it's probably not $12 million. Okay, other questions on this?
I think naturally, again, this might be sort of a future thinking question, but if people start to see, well, we're going to rebuild new, what happens when we rebuild new to these, 4 or 5 buildings? So do they just sit? Are we going to try to sell them? I imagine that those costs or those revenues, if we were to sell them, aren't included in these numbers or looking
Right.
forward. But I think that would be a question that people would ask. Well, what are you going to do with those buildings then?
Yeah. So, and that's a great conversation that will need to be had at some point here, a little bit later in the process. We want to try to kind of tackle this from a philosophical standpoint probably first. But what I will tell you is that generally speaking, and this is just generally speaking, older school buildings like that, in particular school buildings that aren't in the best shape, shall we say, are not generally valued real high. So selling the building, not likely something that we see people doing often. You might be able to sell it for $1 to a developer who may want to reuse that building in some other capacity, but obviously has to invest a considerable amount of money into it to bring it up to speed. So there are a variety of things ways that those buildings might be dealt with, as well as the land that's there. But those are handled at the moment in a neutral standpoint. So no cost incurred, but no revenue seen either.
Tom, can you go back to the slide that has the priorities that go from 1 to 5? That lists 1 to 1.5, 1 to 2, the different categories, and then the highest category you outlined.
Yeah, sorry. We talked so much about priorities earlier that this one here.
Yeah, so if we did a bond and we covered the immediate priorities, are all the other priorities covered by an increased building fund mill? Or how would, because even though they're not high, the moderate priorities eventually are going to become high priorities. So will those be covered by a more flush building fund?
Some of them will be, but if you take a look at the dollar amounts, so we'll get to this in just a second when we talk about building fund, but you will not be able to realize enough revenue in that building fund to cover all of this. Go ahead, Cynthia.
So this is where my question comes from, because high immediate priorities are West at 2 million, Wilder at 654,000, Winship at 1,203,000. At Valley at, 13,000, or 13 million.
Yeah.
259. So that's where, this is where my question comes from. So I appreciate Eric bringing it up too.
Yeah.
Like I don't quite know how to wrestle with those two ideas.
Right, and we'll walk through that. So just stick with us a little bit here. Continue to ask questions as we go through, but we're going to kind of walk through a process that will hopefully help you be able to wrangle with those different ideas that we've got here.
I have a question.
ahead, Bill.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm
Bill.
sorry.
I think the other number we need to look at is deferred maintenance, because if we get rid of these buildings, we get rid of that deferred maintenance, and that's the philosophy the University of North Dakota is using on some of their older buildings.
No question.
You know, and I think we can't say we're gonna keep those buildings for future use. I think we have to tell the public, in my mind, that, hey, if we get rid of a school, I'll say West School, because I'm popular at West School, the 3.8, we take that off our list, you know, so I think that's important.
Correct. Yeah. One of the things that works well when you talk about replacement or consolidation or any of those concepts, that there is a cost avoidance, obviously, and a fairly significant cost avoidance. If you look just even at the column of immediate priority, but then all of the priorities, and again, these are deferred maintenance dollars here. So this is not trying to like bring us up to the standard that Discovery Middle School might, or Discovery Elementary School may have, 21st century learning environments, that type of. This is the deferred maintenance, and deferred and regular maintenance that would need to be happening on those buildings. Amber, I know you had a question.
Yeah, I'm just curious why MSEC doesn't have any dollar figures for any priorities, and then, you know, I think the general public would say New South K-5 school. What is that? You know, why is that on the list?
Yep.
Obviously, we have land south of town, but haven't really talked about utilizing that in the near future. So,
Yep.
I guess just a comment on that. Is that something that, you know, number-wise projection, that would be the logical thing? Should we even have it on this sort of list, or?
Well, it shows up there because it's part of the entire planning program, that it may be required at some point. And if you take a look at the demographer's report and the growth reports that are there, you purchase land. At some point, there's quite possibly going to be a need for a school in the south part of town. As you can see, there's no dollars associated here from a deferred maintenance standpoint because that building doesn't exist. And the task force talked about the fact that one could be needed at some point in the future, but really didn't address that in any of their recommendation either.
And then the MSCC.
That one I can't answer. Brian, are you able to answer why there are no deferred maintenance costs, at least with the Mark Sanford Center? It looks like you're going to say something, Derry.
Well, I might say a little bit. You know, we certainly don't want to convolute, you know, the focus on teaching and learning. Does this building need some maintenance upgrades? Absolutely. We're able to use a little bit of the CARES Act money to upgrade our, Chris, I'm going to start talking out of turn here if I'm starting to get into your wheelhouse. But just our heating and cooling system that needed an upgrade. There's some things we've simply bypassed as far as deferred maintenance, like the carpet in this room. You know, those would be some simple things. But Chris, if you want to come to the microphone and just talk a little bit about.
Sorry, Chris, I didn't see you sitting back there. Otherwise, I would have called on you right off the bat.
Thank you, Chris.
Hi, everyone. Chris Arnold, Director of Buildings and Grounds. Yeah, Mark Sanford Center, yeah, absolutely has deferred maintenance. I think in the grand scheme of things, we did not target this building as probably our highest priority. So we can add it to the list, but we really have been able to tamp down the maintenance in here outside of, carpet fraying apart, block work blowing apart on the outside of the building. We've been able to keep up with most of it. We are starting to get to a point, just along with South and Phoenix, where we're having to invest back into these properties to keep them looking good and working, so we can get that added.
I think it certainly would be important to see those numbers in an overall picture, and, I hope we wouldn't just be relying on our popcorn sales to keep up this building. So, again, it may not be a priority on our list, so to speak, in terms of student educational experience, but this is a building that is on the district, facility plan. And so I would appreciate seeing just what those numbers are.
We'll get them added on there.
All right, and again, the intent tonight isn't to look too closely at individual buildings. We'll have an opportunity to kind of start, diving a little bit deeper into some of this at our upcoming meetings, but understanding the perspective of kind of where we're at here. Okay, so from a building fund standpoint, we talked at the task force meetings a lot about the difference between catching up and keeping up. And so when you talk about deferred maintenance, there's a fair amount of catching up you need to do to keeping the buildings going. When we talk about the building fund, we're talking to a large extent about keeping up the buildings and doing more routine or regular projects that need to be done as opposed to the deferred things under normal circumstances. So just from a building fund standpoint, and you guys may all know this here, and this is partially, I guess, for the community as well, but the building fund itself, generally smaller amounts of money, but annually reoccurring revenue stream. So this is money that you're able to tax for and you bring in each year, but it's not like a great big huge pot of money like you would see with a bond. Statutorily, you're limited to 20 mils of tax per year on this. Voter approved is only required once. And so once you've approved the 20 mils max, 5 mils additional, 10 mils additional, whatever that is, you don't need to go back and do that each year or every 4 years or something like that. The dollars that are seen through the building fund are able to be used only from a building and infrastructure project standpoint. So we can't buy textbooks with this. We can't pay staff with this money. It's really for building and infrastructure types of projects. These are typically smaller projects, mostly because the dollar amounts are smaller. Items with less than a 20-year life cycle, what we're talking about there is that typically we don't want a bond for a project or equipment that's only going to last 12 years, for instance. We don't want to be paying for something in a 20-year bond that its life cycle is run out. So if you have something with a shorter life cycle, this would be the more appropriate place generally to look at those. And then this also does provide those funds for those emergency building needs if and when they occur. So in your standpoint here, from a building fund standpoint, your current building fund is 10 mils. It's about $2.5 million that you receive annually in taxes. However, that's unavailable to use on the projects and the deferred maintenance things that we're talking about right now, because it's pledged to paying off debt that you have. And that debt starts to run out in 2029 is when some of those current building funds would begin to become available to use for these other types of projects. So if we look at additional building fund, and most, or many at least, of the schools in North Dakota will go to 20 mils of building fund That's, again, the limit. So if you were to add 10 mils of building fund to your budget, that'd give you an additional $2.5 million a year, roughly. And the cost on that, as you can see here, is about $9.38 per month from a tax impact standpoint to that average $250,000 home. All right, and this is why we tend to use those monthly dollar amounts, because they're just a little bit easier to keep straight in our head as we take a look at what the pieces are. So for reference, because the task force had discussed the 5 mils, we also show the $4.69 there. Obviously fairly easy math to get to that number. So that's giving you some perspective. So questions on building fund and kind of how that works? When you go to, so go ahead.
I don't have a question per se in the building fund, but Scott, I'm sure where there's some bonding bills in the legislatures, some different things with bonds, and I'm not familiar with all of them, but does that seem like it might have any effect on sort of how we bond and what we could ask for at all? I know it's very early on in the process, but I don't know if you have any comment on that.
I haven't seen anything specific to school districts. I know the legislature as a whole is looking at potentially bonding for some very large civil projects like roads and bridges and things of that nature. I'm not aware of anything for school districts within that. But yeah, within, with our outstanding debt, really up until the year 2029, our principal and interest obligations on an annual basis are approximately 2.4 to 2.5 million, and that's what the 10 mils generates. So in 2029, our principal and interest obligation cuts to about half of that. So at that point, we would have about 1.25 million additional funds available for construction purposes at that point in time. And then by 2033, I believe, all of our current debt will have been paid off at that point. And our current debt structure is, you'll recall we refunded some debt last year at a much lower interest rate. There's about $11 or $12 million of our roughly $25 million of outstanding debt is tax or federally subsidized in that 2009-2010 time period when the financial crisis was occurring at that point. And so our interest rate is nets to like about 0.75% on a lot of that debt. So we did look at potentially trying to, and Amber, you had a question I think at last meeting about potentially consolidating some of our current debt. But the way it's structured, and with the interest rate so low, actually even lower than what we could get currently, it likely makes sense to just continue on with that process as within 8 or 9 years, about half of that goes away.
Scott, if we had a building fund mill of 20 mills for the last 10 years, what would be our ending fund balance at the end of this school year? Just roughly to like the nearest thousand. I'm joking.
Well, if I get within $250 of the total, I think I get both grand prizes. Is how it works. Currently the 10 mills that we do have generates about $2.5 million a year. So if we would have had that the last 10 years, would have had about 25 million in additional funding roughly.
So we would have what we would say an acceptable ending fund balance with enough reserve that accounts and everybody else recommends we have the 15 to 18%.
Right, and more than likely, a lot of those dollars probably would have went to some of our current deferred maintenance, so it would have been in better shape probably from a deferred maintenance standpoint.
Anyone else? Okay, so I will talk a little bit about the capital side of things, or the catching up piece of this. So from a bonding standpoint, this is a larger revenue stream. We're talking, tens of millions of dollars oftentimes. Voter approval is required for each occurrence, and so if we want to go to bonding to do a project, that requires voter approval, and each time that we would want to do that would require another referendum vote. Typically, bonds are paid back with interest over a 20-year period. There is some flexibility there, but that is what's most often seen. These, again, are for building and infrastructure projects. Typically larger projects because of the larger dollar amounts that are seen. And here, typically items that have a greater than 20-year life cycle, so again, that we're not paying on something that we're no longer using. So when you take a look at this, interest rates have a big effect on the bonding that we do. And right now, interest rates are historically low. So fantastic time to borrow money if you need to borrow money. We are working with another district that sold bonds just in the last month here. The interest rate that they were able to get on that was less than 1.5%. So very, very favorable from a rate standpoint. So that interest rate matters from the standpoint that the lower the interest rate, the more funding that is available for us to actually put into our projects at the same impact amount. If we're talking about the same dollar amount, then the lower the interest rate, the less impact it has on the homeowner. And so, as you can see here, that 1% interest reduction results in about $6 million less in interest. All the numbers that we're talking about here tonight were based on about 2.375% interest. So as I had mentioned, this other school district that we're working with has gotten an interest rate just less than 1.5%. So you can see that that's a fairly significant impact. Now, we don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know what interest rates are going to do in the near future, but those interest rates do make doing bonding right now quite attractive, in particular for school districts. So going to the task force recommendation then, as it kind of ties into this bonding piece of it, and we're working our way up to having some conversation and some decisions. But this comes off of the task force recommendation, and one of the things, and we've looked at this map here with you guys already as well. This is that map where we looked at the condition, the stoplight report, and the condition of our buildings and which ones and where they are. And when the task force looked at that, one of the things that they looked at was the potential for consolidation and kind of taking a look at these three areas as being somewhat logical lines that could be drawn from a consolidation standpoint. One of the things that they looked at is that as you look at doing some consolidation and doing those projects, whether it is on the northern area with the W's and Valley replacing that infrastructure, or when you talk about Ben Franklin and Lewis and Clark bringing those schools together, you would have an opportunity at, in this case, Ben Franklin, where they could come together, improving the infrastructure that's there to a point with that it, again, looks like and feels like the type of school building that you see at Discovery. So when they took a look at that and understood that if they were to go through those consolidation projects, that after completing those projects, that this is what that heat map would now look like from the quality of infrastructure that you have in place. And so you do address a significant number of your needs through that consolidation process if that's an option that you guys end up looking to explore. So I'll let you take a look at that, and then I'm going to give you a little bit more information, and then we will have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of this. So the unique thing about the consolidation, and I think most of the task members probably would say that initially, if we had mentioned this in meeting one for some reason, we had a crystal ball and said, you know, this is what your recommendation is going to be, or even when they first started exploring the idea that they weren't exactly enamored with that idea, at least all of them. And, but this is one of the things here that they looked at pretty seriously, and that's looking at the operating costs and how this has an impact on your operating budget that the other options don't really have. And so when we take a look at, as by way of example, the 3 Ws and Valley, and we look at in very general terms what their costs are, from a utility standpoint and from a labor standpoint and benefit standpoint, you can kind of see what we have there, about $11,700,000 a year in cost from an operational standpoint at those schools combined. So if we build some new schools, and we had just named them so that there were nothing in particular, Grinnell and Weber, in the process. But if we were to take a look at a new middle school and a new elementary school, we show there what the operational costs are. Now, I want to point out a few things, though, that are there in that cost calculation. From a utility standpoint, in order to try to project what those utilities are, we looked at South Middle School and Discovery Elementary School and what the utility costs were at those schools as good comparisons as being air-conditioned schools, relatively new schools, to project what the utility costs would be for the new elementary and middle school that might be part of this consolidation project. The other thing that you'll take a look at is from a certified staff standpoint. Now, these are our teachers. You'll see that the cost is identical between these two here. We thought it was important to take a look at that from the standpoint that we would simply bring each of the classes from each of those buildings together in one building and not, say, get into the politics of the idea of increased class sizes and those types of things, right? We wanted to keep things the same, all right? So all those classes were transferred over. From a classified standpoint here, there is some savings there, and that's because there is some overlap from a classified staff standpoint when you do some consolidation. Not perhaps as many lunchroom people are needed. Custodial staff would not necessarily need to be quite as large, those types of things. And so we discounted, I believe it was roughly 20% of the classified staff, but we left the most of the classified staff on because those also included paraprofessionals and student aides and those types of things. And so we did not cut those in an extreme manner. And then, of course, there's some benefit savings along with that. So when that all rolls up and we take a look at the cost savings, we end up with what is likely to be somewhat of a conservative number of $750,000 in annual operating savings by going to this model. So if we take a look at all three of those potential consolidations, because that was just one example of the three that you saw on that map, if you looked at all three of those consolidation examples in totality, it's about $1.75 million in operating savings annually. There are probably additional savings that could be realized in this model as well. So for instance, there would be reduced maintenance costs from what you have today because you'd have new structures and you'd have a single structure. There would be some savings from a lunch delivery standpoint, for instance, because you only have one drop-off point as opposed to having to go to 3 different schools to drop those types of things. So there are those additional operational costs that would have some savings to it. Now, part of the reason that in this example that we didn't try to go to a fine-tooth comb and calculate all of those is because there could be some additional operating cost increases, depending on how this all lays out. When you talk about transportation, there might be a little bit of extra busing cost and that type of thing, possibly. And so we went to kind of the big numbers and looked at those and understood that that was a conservative look and that there would be likely some additional savings there that we could look at further on down the road if this becomes a viable option. In addition to that, there's some programmatic benefits as well. And so you would be not only taking care of deferred maintenance, as I think Eric had pointed out, that there's some cost avoidance to numbers that you see on the deferred maintenance list by doing this, but now you are also getting into a newer school that's got 21st century learning environment. We've got the environmental variables like temperature and sound and lighting and humidity and those types of things taken care of, right? So there are some great programmatic opportunities there. There's also the opportunity for kids to have a broader friend base and more diverse kids to integrate with, and an increased ability for teacher collaboration. So these are some of the things that the task force talked about. Now, of course, the other thing is that we would be migrating away from the idea of neighborhood schools, which is also an important concept as well. So when we take a look at this, I bring back our priority list of what we had from a priority standpoint and say, okay, if we think about what that opportunity offers and how does it connect with our priorities, you guys can kind of think about that a little bit. What I will show you is that through conversations at the task force, this type of an opportunity checks most of the boxes from a priority standpoint. Cost and tax impact, obviously this is has a fairly good tax impact to it. It's spending some fair amount of money, so that one wasn't necessarily checked, but really checks the box on a lot of these priorities. And so I'm happy to stop at this point and let you ask some questions or provide some input on what some of your thoughts are here relative to the priorities. And then I've got kind of an alternate look as well that we can take a look at after this. Go ahead, Eric.
In the past, when we've talked about consolidation and other things, the concept of neighborhood schools has come up quite often, and I'm not sure I believe in it anymore, because if you look at the boundary lines of our elementary schools, I don't think any of them fit the criteria where all the kids can walk to. We'd have to build 4 or 5 new elementary schools, I think. What I'm curious about is what kind of conversations did the task force have about the concept of neighborhood schools versus consolidation or bigger schools?
And if you're willing, I can certainly see if any of them are willing to comment. I think
Please do.
The one comment that stands out to me that was mentioned is we all like and understand neighborhood schools, but and I probably won't get the words right, but that ship has kind of sailed at this point. That's just not a realistic concept today, even though it was at one time, and we understand what those things were that we liked about it. But I'd certainly open it up to any of you guys who want to make a comment on this.
As they're coming up, I have a comment about that. Just my daughters are both in their mid-30s, and so they went to school here a long time ago, and our house was 1.5 miles from their neighborhood school, and that was 30 years ago. Go ahead, Josh.
I think, Josh Anderson, my name, first of all. I think, summing it up real quickly, I would say a lot of our conversation went to neighborhood schools was a concept and talked about walking to, as you just mentioned. But a lot of our conversation went to a neighborhood school is what the people inside of it, the students, the teachers, everyone make it. So, you know, we had people obviously from all over, and so we had people talk about how, you know, the elementary that their students, their kids attended was a neighborhood school, and they had a feeling of everyone knowing each other and so on and so forth. But at the same time, on the flip side, we had, you know, much larger student base, Discovery or whatever, neighborhood school, and the same concept came out, that students very much knew everyone, the family feel, neighborhood feel, everyone knew everyone. So I think it came out more that it was about the relationships and what the school environment builds for the student, more than the ability for that student to be able to walk across the street to their school. I think that would be what I would go for. Anyone else? You're welcome.
Lori Hollifield, and I spoke from the perspective of a traveling teacher where I was part-time in 2 schools. And I kept emphasizing the point that the small schools have so many part-time people, depending on the year, a part-time principal, a part-time librarian, a part-time counselor, and special education is becoming broader and more complicated, so the specialists are becoming more specialized. Well, with that in mind, you'll have fewer students at these smaller schools needing a particular specialist, so then the specialists are traveling. And with the larger school, I kept emphasizing, you're going to have these full-time people available, and when the students have a crisis, there are going to be more people available to rely upon. Now, I realize that's probably a message that we have to get out to the community, but it did have an impact on, there were 2 very strong voices for neighborhood schools in our task force, and those comments did have a very strong impact on them.
Tim Delmore. One thing to keep in mind when we're talking about neighborhood schools is that the neighborhood schools would be to old buildings. You know, we're not going to build a new elementary in every spot. So the choice is, do we have a neighborhood school that's falling apart, or do we have a newer school or a brand new school that's farther away? And I think if you look at that, even if you talk to West people that are now going to Discovery, you know, I think they see a real difference in what the buildings can do.
Hi, Dean Coons, and I want to speak to it as a parent who had a child who went to a neighborhood school. There was a unique challenge for our son, and that a couple of the years attending that neighborhood school, he was at a combined grade classroom, which really stretched teaching resources. So in 2nd grade, for example, he was in a combined 2nd grade, 3rd grade classroom. So the teacher was trying to provide educational quality to both 2nd and 3rd grade students at the same time in the same classroom. And the teacher did a great job, but it was hard. And that does stretch resources, and it does say, hey, if my 2nd grader's in a 2nd, 3rd grade classroom, maybe they're getting more challenged. But if a 3rd grader's in a 2nd, 3rd grade classroom, then are they being held back? We don't know. So that conversation definitely occurred in those neighborhood schools.
Thank you. As I've looked at this, thinking of the students, being fiscally responsible and political, and as I was looking at the map, I went to my mind's eye as a person who lives in Grand Forks in those areas, and I know that, say, the North End, if we were to do some new building, I think of the neutrality of the schools, making sure that whatever that neutrality is, that the families know what is going to be happening, because we certainly don't want them to be looking at a school building that's just going to slowly rot, and I don't think the district would allow that to happen yet. thinking about that neutrality. What are we going to do with those schools as we transition new? Because I think if the taxpayers know that, the homeowners know that, they're going to be in a much better place. Perhaps the one that might be a little more challenging, again, this is my mind's eye, when we look at Lewis and Clark and Ben Franklin, we have Washington. So you know what the families on Ben Franklin want, and you know what the families of Lewis and Clark would want. You know where they want that school, on the proper side of Washington. So that too is a political piece I think that we need to be thinking about. Should we go down the path of combining? I'm not saying that we are. I'm just trying to think in my mind's eye, what is a parent looking at when they see this? What is the community thinking about as they see this? And how will that impact their thinking as we start to go with a referendum of some sort? So I'm trying to be very fiscally thoughtful, yet also trying to say, as a parent, as a taxpayer, what am I seeing from my perspective? Just some thoughts that I had. And again, I think this would be what we call parking lot material.
I was just going to mention that, Chris. I appreciate the thoughts and the comments. What the specifics are around consolidation is something that tonight we're going to ask you the question, is consolidation, the concept of consolidation, a component of what our solution is moving forward? If it is, then we'll talk more about what the specifics are, because there are some options to take a look at, both from a cost standpoint and a configuration standpoint, if you will, that we can try to look at the next meeting. But so exactly what you're saying, I think, is right, and that'll be great conversation for our next meeting, if you guys determine that that is something that we should talk about.
I think, to your point, parking lot, but I also wanted to say, I think we have examples of the boundary conversation too, because like Eric said, you know, there are people on the edge of a boundary line having to travel for a neighborhood school. I mean, we live on the east side of Washington, and my daughter's school is on the west side of Washington. You know, there's kids that are on the west side of Washington that have to go to Viking. And so we do have additional examples of the way our boundaries are set. But I think that it's good to think of those circumstances where then we could provide, you know, here's what we're dealing with in other aspects. I think one thing I look at in terms of priority interconnection, and maybe telling a story on here, certainly if we can add flexibility and quality of teaching learning environment, but a lot of these headers don't necessarily tend to speak about teachers and teaching and the value of the input of what they're putting in and the output that the students receive. And so, you know, I certainly see and could interpret that a quality learning environment and teaching and learning environment, students' ability to learn and excel, one could assume that that is a result of great teaching staff. But I think we also, it would be important to identify to people and to have the question be asked, how do we communicate to the public that this isn't just about infrastructure? At some point, we're going to need to mirror and have the story told and connect the piece of recruitment and retention of our teachers. And, you know, I think we need to discuss that while infrastructure might be a priority now, the infrastructure piece and relieving our general budget funds from being thrown to infrastructure will allow us to have more funds available to staff and teachers to be able to have a quality learning environment. So again, that might be a parking lot statement, but I think what I see here is some infrastructure heavy type stuff in order to impact the learning environment. It's not super clear that the teacher is a important aspect of that.
Other thoughts? I guess as you're thinking about, if you have another thought, one thing I'm going to just make a comment to, and off of what you said, Amber, this is not directly to what you said, however, but you had made a comment about how do we get this communicated to the community, and how do they understand these types of things. I do want to caution you to, when you're going through this process, whether it's this subject or another subject that we end up tackling over the next couple of meetings, is don't make your decision based on whether or not you believe this can be clearly communicated or not. Because I think you have some great talent in the district. We also are able to bring some great examples and experience to being able to communicate things to the community. And so I don't want anybody to think that communication should be a reason to make a choice of one option or another as being right? We want to make sure that we're certainly looking at this from your perspective as educational leaders in this district of really what is the right decision, answering those three questions that we talked about at the beginning, and not necessarily be worried about whether or not we can communicate this out or not. So, and that's not meant to directly read it, but I thought of it as you were saying that. So, did you want to add something, Terry?
When it's board discussion, I never know what my role is in board discussion, but I just wanted to add a couple of comments. First of all, Lori, Jeff, Josh, Dean, Tim, who are here tonight, they certainly represent a great cross-representation of our community. And just hearing their presentation several weeks ago, knowing why some of them applied to be on the task force was compelling. And then the result and the recommendations that they made, considering where they started, was compelling. So I just wanted to thank them again for their work, and thank you for continuing to come to these meetings. After 60 hours, you still want more. That's impressive. The other thing, Tom, when you were talking about the 1.75 million in conservative savings of that kind of a Valley WWW model, certainly is conservative. If you really, and I know your intent wasn't to dive deeper into the details, but the savings would be much more than that, and Lori touched on that tonight, from teacher travel to part-time to some of the wonderful benefits of a small school, and having a single section school is, if you've got 12 in your classroom, you've got 12 in your classroom. But that does become inefficient over time, and by collapsing, then we can still have reasonable class numbers, but fewer of those classes of, the bubbles of, and bubble isn't the right word, but a bubble of 12. So, and I think what Chris was getting to is, in all of this, we can talk about the financial impact on a monthly basis, but what's really the impact on families? And I think that's where Chris was coming from. We can talk about what our operation fund's going to be if we have a successful referendum, but what is that bottom line family impact? And I want to be sensitive to balancing all of that. And probably what I'm saying is like 5 parking lots away, so I'll just stop right now.
It's good input, and as far as from my facilitation standpoint, Terry, your comments are always welcome. So don't be hesitant. Go ahead, Cynthia.
I just have one trailing thought, and that is, I think we probably need to redefine the word neighborhood school.
Mm-hmm.
And have that community, kind of what Josh was talking about, just the whole idea of it's a community and everybody knows each other, that can be within the school. So just a clear definition of that, I think, would be really helpful.
I know many other school districts, and I don't know if that's my computer that's doing that. It must be, huh? I'm going to go take a look at that quick, Karen. Defining community or neighborhood school. So I know other districts that have tackled that. My own district, for instance, when they went through a reboundering, attendance boundary area, had that same question. And the question is, do you define a neighborhood school by the neighborhood that the school is in, or do you define it by the school that the neighborhood goes to? you know? So there's a lot of different ways to take a look at what a neighborhood school is defined as and what it looks and feels like. All right, so from a background, going back to this background here area, I'm not quite sure what happened there.
Chris, are you working on those numbers for MSEC? Just curious.
Electrical wiring is going to be added.
Or there we go. Okay, I'm going to just stay up here for just 1 second, I guess. Okay, so from a background data standpoint, so we come back and take a look at this. And so we had these immediate priorities. Yeah. I have no idea why it's decided to run an update right now. Thank Microsoft, apparently. All right, so from this immediate priority area here, when we talk about consolidation and we take a look at what the consolidation has as an effect on this, so going exactly to what Eric was talking about before, the cost avoidance component of this, there are some reductions that we see in this list, but not everything from this list goes away, of course, when we look at consolidation. And so we can drop about $18 or so million of the 50 off as part of that consolidation effort. Now, there's a lot of other benefits, obviously, as we've talked about, to doing consolidation, but as it relates to that immediate priority list, that's about what would come off. Now, approximately 40% of those immediate needs, going back to our discussion about fund balance versus bonding, about 40% or about 20 million of those things would be considered more long-term types of investments. And so where we talk about secure entryways, for instance, those are things that would stay with a building for, a long lifetime. About 60% of those immediate needs, or about $30 million, are kind of more shorter term or smaller type projects that would be more appropriate to a building fund amount. It's not that you couldn't use either or for it, but would probably fall more in the building fund category. All right, so just wanted to point that out. Now, the alternate thought of what you could do if you did not do consolidation then with the dollars that you potentially have available is obviously to try to address or tackle more of the projects in this area and potentially, start working your way to the left of those priority items. Okay, so that's the alternative opportunity that you have. So when we take a look at that alternative proposition of going and addressing deferred maintenance items, we again kind of come back to that priority look at these things. And again, relative to things that the task force talked about, these are kind of those areas of priority that are checked off by addressing deferred maintenance items only, okay? And so I'll let you take a look at that while I hopefully can move back to the other spot.
interesting part from this list is that was our top 4 priorities that we voted on, those check marks.
Correct, yes, these are listed in the area that you ranked them. And again, as we talk, ranking maybe not of ultimate importance, but yes, you're absolutely right. The light green check marks are kind of like a half. And so if we look at that deferred maintenance stuff, does it address students' ability to learn, excel, and be successful? Yes, there are some certain there's certainly projects in there that help that. But doesn't address all of the things that would be addressed or want to be addressed in that priority. Safety, security, and accessibility, obviously, we have a lot of those things in there. Budget, sustainability, fiscal responsibility, obviously, taking care of a number of those projects does play into that. Healthy, comfortable environment. We're addressing a lot of HVAC, air quality types of things. But again, air conditioning and some of those other things are not involved in that deferred maintenance project work. So kind of a half a check mark there. And then many of these other things that are further down on the list tend to a variety of programming experiences and those types of things that are really not addressed in deferred maintenance.
About the safety, security, and accessibility one, so doesn't that include good entrances, safe entrances? And I don't know that the deferred maintenance plan includes some of those changes to entrance areas.
It does.
It does?
It does. Well, there it goes. I thought saying no would have reset the clock, but so we'll have a little bit of conversation while that restarts quickly here. But yes, the immediate needs do include the secure entryways. Anybody else have thoughts on what we were looking at there before it shut down on its own? It is restarting now, by the way. Or if anybody needs a quick restroom break.
I'd just like to share something I learned this evening, just to address one of our students. Alicia and I were conversing before we got here, and she had a full day of school. She came to a 5:30 school board meeting, and at 8:30 she has dance tonight. So when we talk about busy lives and how busy we are and all the things we have and we don't have the time for this or that, I look at this 16?
16.
This 16-year-old student and what she is doing with the time that she has. What an awesome person to have on this board, and she does it so willingly, without reservation. And this is our future, and I'm sure Evan, as I compliment Alicia, you are in the same boat. Just a thought that I had as we were conversing before the meeting started. It's really refreshing to know that we have people that are so willing to give of so much time to so many ways.
Thank you.
Alicia, would you be willing to take Chris to dance tonight so he could learn some dance moves?
Oh yeah, we talked about it.
All right, sorry about that diversion. I've not actually ever had a computer quit on me in the middle of a presentation like that. So, all right, so certainly those deferred maintenance things are important to us. But again, as we go back and try to check those against our priorities, not quite as many check boxes here, but as Amber said, they are at least the higher check boxes. And so clearly some benefits are achieved there. All right, so I'm going to show you this again before we go into kind of our last two questions of the meeting. So we're kind of tracking pretty well from a time standpoint here. So you had told us earlier, we settled on this number of about $30 to $32 for a total tax impact. And so now what we want to try to determine is how much of that goes towards the building fund and how much of that would be available from a bonding standpoint. And so the question that I'm going to ask you here in 1 second to weigh in on your computers is how much money should we allocate to the building fund from that tax impact of $32. Now, what you need to understand is $9.38 is the most that you can do there. Statutorily, that's your limit. Okay, so you can kind of see the breakdown there, 10 mils, 8 mils, 6 mils, 4 mils, 2 mils. And you don't have to have those dollar amounts exact. But if you want to jot them down, you can. I can't show both the polling question and this slide at the same time, unfortunately. In order for the poll to be open and work, it has to be up on the screen. So, so 938 is the max. $1.88 would be the smallest. So I'll give you a second just to take a look at that. I'm going to jot them down in case you need them. Okay. I will double check and make sure that the poll is open unless I guess I can, is it open? Okay, good. So again, this is the same thumbs up, thumbs down, or up vote, if you will, exercise. Okay, so feel free to go ahead and type in that dollar amount that you believe is the right dollar amount from a fund balance or a building fund standpoint. 938 being the highest. 940 if you want, all the way down to well, theoretically 0, although you had told us previously that that fund balance or building fund should be a part of this. So 938 is 10 mils, 750 is 8 mils, 563 is 6 mils, 375 is 4 mils, and $1.88 is 2 mils. All right, is everybody in at this point? No? Still seeing a few changes. You can just double check and make sure you've weighed in on each of the options in case somebody's added an option. Everybody's in? Everybody done? Okay, so from the looks of this, we've got a couple of 938s up there. The 9 and the 850 are downvoted. And then we've got a 470 and a 563. So to me, it looks like you're talking about a 10 mil increase in building fund. Do you believe I am accurate on that? Or is there any dissenting opinion on that? Or anybody that's particularly uncomfortable with that? Go ahead, Bill.
It's too high. Personally, I think it's too high.
Too high. Now understand that when what you put into building fund, you know, obviously reduces the amount you can do on the capital side. And so the 10 mills of building fund equate to about $40 million in bonding, round numbers. You know, so each mill is about $4 million in bonding. So if you went to 8 mills, for instance, you'd have about $8 million more from a bonding standpoint within that same impact that you could use to, you know, continue to whittle away at those things. And again, you get a little bit more bang for your buck immediately when you do the bonding. Interest rates are low. You get that money now. You do have to pay it back over time with some interest. With the building fund, it's a little bit more secure. It's regular year over year, and you're not paying interest on that money. So there's some advantages to both directions there.
I guess how I look at it, though, is the general public, dealing with the general public, is a bonding bill has an end date. It's over with. The building fund, they can say can go on forever.
Correct.
And sometimes people struggle with that, voting yes to something that doesn't have an end.
Yep.
But yet a bonding bill, I know that in, 2052, it'll be over with, you know. I won't be here, but it'll be over with. So.
Go ahead, Eric.
See, and the other old guy here thinks the exact opposite of Bill. I think, let's get it over, let's move it to 20 mills, and then it's there forever. I also worry a little bit about building buildings, doing all that, and then having a bond fund or a building fund that sits at 10 mills and can't keep up deferred maintenance down the road. Mm-hmm. But I can see both sides of the argument, but that's why I put the 9.38. The other thing is, I think people have figured out how to game this voting system a little bit. It's kind of like when you vote for school board, you can vote for 4 or 5, but you tell all your friends, well, only vote for me because I'm competing against everybody else. So I think the people have kind of figured out this system a little bit.
You guys do that too in your elections, huh?
So I was looking at the recommendation of the task force, and
Yep.
they suggested as an option, considering requesting an additional 5 mills of building fund levy as part of phase 1. And so I was kind of trying to take into
Yep.
account what you all did for so long
Yep.
when I voted.
So the task force had about $90 million in bonding, and they, depending on how you looked at it, had 5 or 10 mills of building fund. It was very important to the task force. Again, hit me in the back here if I'm speaking incorrectly. It was very important for them that as a part of this plan going forward, there is an ability to keep up. And the comment I heard a lot was, we don't want to ever be in this position again. And so we want to be able to have a mechanism to make sure we're not going to be in this position again. And building fund is obviously a significant component of that. So building fund was important. Now, addressing deferred maintenance, also important. And so I think what they were trying to do is kind of walk both sides of that line a little bit as well as they could. Their recommendation was to start with a north consolidation. If you recall, there's a dollar amount to that. They had about 20 million or so left of bonding that they could continue to address other deferred maintenance items. Right? Doesn't knock out all of that list, but it makes a big dent in that list, obviously, more than a dent. Your dollar, their impact was about $25 a month. And the impact here that you guys are talking about is more along the lines of $30 a month, right? So you have additional bonding potential there than what they had to, again, address those deferred maintenance issues. So I just wanted to try to clarify that. Did I do a reasonable job with that, guys? Okay.
I wonder too if there's sort of a thought to, we haven't really done a referendum in quite some time, probably since I've been alive. Does 10 seem too big because our community's just not a 10 mil bond or building fund asked, does it seem too big because our community's not used to it? So do you do sort of a phased approach and roll in? On the other side, ask for the money to provide something tangible, to say, here's what we can do with our money, while also sort of maintaining our buildings, but then do another slow roll to say, you know, here's your short term over here, and here's our long-term sustainability, so we have to come back and ask again, but we'll lessen the blow right away, knowing that we're, you know, going to ask and sort of get them used to that participation in helping with the school district funding. So I don't know what that feel is for the community, because it would seem like we're just not used to that as a community like Fargo or West Fargo might be.
Right, yeah. And every community is a little bit different in their response on that type of thing. Again, I think if you guys are very confident that this is the right way to go and it's in line with what the task force has done, that is a good and confident message to the community, which is very important. So again, relying on your expertise here as district leaders, that's very important in this process. The other thing is that I think relative to the building fund, in going to your point, Bill, one of the things there that we don't necessarily see in all states when there's kind of this reoccurring year over year ability to levy dollars, the state has a built-in mechanism to limit what you can do as a school district. And so I think part of the message to the community is there is a reason there's a statutory 20 mil limit on that. And all you're trying to do is get to that specific limit, and that there are some sideboards put on school districts to make sure that they're not being irresponsible from that standpoint. And so, you know, I think that's part of perhaps an explanation to the concern that you had. Go ahead, Chris.
Mr. Berge, I don't mean to put you on the spot. That being said, I suppose. As you're listening to this discussion, working with numbers as much as you do, understanding the process as well as you do, what recommendation would you have in what would be best? If you have a recommendation, if you prefer not to respond to that, I certainly respect that.
It's as with pretty much everything we've talked about tonight, it's a balancing act. The building fund, is really for that long-term sustainability of our buildings, and so from the perspective now we have a 10 mil building fund, but in actuality we're using all of those 10 mils to pay down debt. That building fund isn't generating dollars to help us with our kind of those short-term deferred maintenance type needs. So where we're at, you can see a few slides ago the $100+ million of really, frankly, deferred maintenance that we have. It's a balancing act to take care of some of those smaller short-term needs, as well as, depending on what you as a board decide on the large-scale plans with facilities, whether it's to do something with each of our facilities or consolidate or whatever. We have to really balance those things out, but without having a reasonable building fund, we're not going to be able to accomplish a lot of those short-term needs. I would hate to go to the taxpayer with, a dollar amount in mind where we can, if it would be consolidate 3 schools and build a new middle school, we get that up and running and it's sustainable. But yet we've got other buildings falling apart because we don't have a building fund available to generate dollars to take care of some of those smaller needs. Which, if you don't take care of those smaller needs as they come up and you keep pushing them off, the true cost of those actually climbs significantly if you go past a certain period of time. So I don't think I answered your question, but I think it's a balancing act that we need to be able to incorporate some of those short-term needs so that over time, it actually lessens the need for more bonding at a future point in time as well.
Thank you.
Good, Eric.
Scott, wouldn't you say in actuality, we already have a 20 mil building fund? It's just that 10 of those mills are coming from our general fund every year. I mean, we're spending money out of our general fund. So we already have a 20 mil fund. It's just that we're funding it through general. So if we don't increase it, we're going to end up behind again.
You're right. Our deficit spending is a direct result of really not having a 20 mil building fund, because the 10 mils that we do have is going to pay principal and interest. I think, Dr. Lund, your question earlier, in theory, had we had a higher building fund over the last 10 years, what would that mean? General fund spending related to construction costs over the last 7 or so years is about $12 million. So when we're talking about maybe having a $5 million general fund balance at the end of this year, we would have been at about $17 or $18 million had we not been forced to spend construction costs out of our general fund.
So just as a follow-up, to me, the big question is not, do we need 10 more mills? We do. The question is, how do we get there? Do we go 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, or do we go 10, 15, 20? But it seems to me at some point we have to get to 20. It's just, do we do it slower or quicker, is my thought.
Right, and I think, I don't have an answer for you tonight. I think it's as we collectively work through these next couple of meetings and determine, what that ultimate plan or what that ask of the community would be. I think that'll help us determine, if it's 4 mills or 5 mills or 10 mills in combination with a bond issue.
I think one of the hard parts for me to understand is, we're sort of trying to determine the dollar amount that we feel comfortable with, but I don't know what it would cost to build a K-8 new Valley. I don't know what it would cost to do an extension on Kelly or Schrader. So I think that's hard for me to put into context, because if it costs $50 million to do a K-8, then why are we asking for $70 million or $90 million on that side? And then, that might mean we go higher on the building fund side. And so, at what point in our conversations will we, it's sort of like the chicken or the egg type thing, when do we start to learn about some of those actual costs for this dollar range that we want to spend, which would then let us choose how we structure our ask?
Yep. So, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, that's part of the frustration sometimes of doing this, because it's kind of a circle how everything interacts with each other. So we got to pick a point to start with, and so we picked this point to say, all right, in this case, I think we're probably right around that 10 mil mark here, and then leaving about a little over $20 of impact a month on the bonding side, which will shake out 20 to 22. That'll shake out somewhere around $90 to $95 million in bonding. Now what we need to do, and we will begin this process at the next meeting, is starting to take a look at where some of those projects lie from a category standpoint, how those tie into the priorities. Again, we'll continue to come back to these priorities and understand how some of those dollars may be used then in the process. Now, if we go through that process and there's a particularly a good reason that the group, wants to come back and make some adjustments, you certainly can do that. This does not lock you in here tonight, but what it does help us do from the ability, this and the next question that I've got for you on consolidation, the concept of consolidation, is it helps us prepare for those discussions to make sure we're bringing the right information forward so that you guys can make good decisions. And then ultimately at the end of this process, we will have a point where we need to officially adopt a resolution that says it is this scope, it is these dollars. But this helps us get in that neighborhood so that we can take a little bit closer look. Does that help make some sense? So at this point, is the group comfortable if we leave 10 mils on the table for the building fund? Because it seems to me that's where I'm hearing most of you are at.
I think so, realizing that there's several other steps that we're gonna be looking at that very, very well may change this. I think as long as people understand this is a preliminary of a preliminary of a preliminary.
Might not be quite that preliminary, but yes. Unless you want to be here for a lot longer. We're going to have to schedule some more meetings. Okay. Now, the next question for tonight, we still got a little bit of time, is should consolidation be considered as a part of the solution? Now, I'm not saying should the north consolidation be the answer forward. Task force went there, right? But should consolidation, is that a component that we need to seriously be looking at as a part of the direction forward? And I think that should be coming up on your screen, and I'm going to have to walk around to my computer, I think, to show the results. So we've got 5 people have entered, so 6, should be 1 more. So you guys are pretty good. Most of these questions that we've been asking, you have had a consensus vote on, so that's great. So 100% of you said yes, consolidation needs to be looked at as a part of this solution. There's obviously options that we have around consolidation to take a look at as you looked at that map, as you saw what those consolidation potentials were. The task force recommended starting in the north. I can tell you that part of that reason is because of Valley Middle School being a component in that. But again, those are some of those things that we'll start to flush out then at our next meeting. And guess what, guys? We finished a few minutes early. So we can certainly entertain some additional discussion and questions if you want, but otherwise I do appreciate, obviously, your work here. Great questions, great conversation. We're not there yet, obviously, but we're getting there. So I appreciate your patience on that. And, you know, again, what it's really all about is getting the kids that are shown on the left picture there to where the kids on the right-hand side are. I mean, that's really what we're all trying to get accomplished. So anyway, any other questions or comments at this point?
Cindy, is our next workshop meeting that Monday, the 5th or 4th or whatever, February?
February 8th.
Is it the Monday?
Yeah, it's typically a regular school board meeting night, but it'll just be a work session.
Other thoughts? No? You're all looking at me.
Tom,
Go
I'd
ahead.
just like to say that, you know, sitting through the facility task force meetings, I know, you know, periodically the question would be asked, would the board honor the work of the task force? And I think you've seen it over the course of our 2 work sessions that your work has been honored. So again, thank you.
Okay, I will turn it back over to whoever gets it. Amber, I guess.
We are adjourned.